treasure, a pirate's treasure. Pirate's treasure that many have been looking for more than 300 years. We're not going to find it, but we're going to establish that treasure and the incredible story that is attached to it in the history of England and Scotland and Great Britain and the Americas and the Indian Ocean. I welcome the authors of a new book, The Pirate King, The Strange Adventures of Henry Avery and the Birth of the Golden Age of Piracy. Sean Kingsley, the historian, Rex Cowan, our guide, a former lawyer and a man who seeks out adventure. But in this instance, the adventure happened at the end of the 17th century. This is a time when the American colonies are new, when the British Empire is putting itself together, and it's found a gem called India. But India has the richest man on earth. He's a Mughal. That is to say, he's made of nothing but wealth paid to him by his people. And in that instance, we begin with the adventure itself. It is September 28th, 1695. There is a pirate ship named Fancy. It's commanded by a man who's known as Long Ben to his men, but whose name is Henry Avery. Rex and Sean, congratulations. This is wonderful. I begin with you, Sean. Who is Henry Avery at this moment? Where did he come from? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having us on your show. Henry Avery is a complicated genius from Plymouth in England. He's had a whole bunch of setbacks in his life, and he swears that he's never going to let anyone make a fool of himself, and he's declared war on mankind. By way of London to Spain, he's made his way all the way to Americas to get rich and get his crew rich. So, you know, in 1695, if you wanted to hit big, if you wanted the biggest lottery ticket on earth, forget about the Caribbean and Spanish shipping. As you said, the richest ticket on earth were the sea lanes between the Red Sea and Mughal India. And it's to this area, the Bab el Mandab, the gateway of tears at the entrance to the Red Sea, that Henry Avery has made his way. And he's sitting there and the clock is ticking, the crew's getting angry and anxious, and they need a big hit. They've been more than 14 months at sea with the crew unpaid, and they want to hit it rich.
Rex, a very good evening to you. Welcome. You are a distinguished shipwreck hunter, a man who's been very much rewarded for your careful archaeology. And we're not searching just for one ship. We're imagining a world where piracy was part of the daily understanding of risk when you set to sea with a treasure, or even carrying crockery across the world. In your experience, all the shipwrecks you've investigated, this event that took place in the Indian Ocean, is it unique? Is this the biggest haul ever made by a pirate? Good evening, Rex.
Hello. Well, it's certainly one of the biggest, and it depends how much focus there is on people who write books and people who study and people who write learned treatises about the subject. It certainly captured all the imagination of people. The stories that proliferated in those days, of course, they were the sort of almost the semi-fiction of excitement that ordinary people got, with stories of treasure, of pillage, and of course of these great fortunes that were made by characters, by pirates, all of whom had their own sort of character effects. And my wife came across this by accident when we were looking actually for a Swedish East India treasure ship, or rather a ship from the Swedish company, which was a very rare event in those days. It was one of the smallest companies. And this letter that popped up in this archive unexpectedly, in terms of what the letters appeared to say, was unusual. And so it took our attention away from what we were looking at for a while, partly because, of course, of the other letter and the other information from the Truro archive, which appeared to show exactly where Avery had hidden his treasure. Now, that's another sort of fiction that proliferated in the story of the romantic story of piracy, which was that somehow pirates hid their treasure away from the authorities. And there was this other letter, which was very different from the one in code, but had attached to it X marks the spot. In those days, letters like that were the sort of common sale by characters who would try to induce people to follow the trail of these huge hauls that were made in piracy, and it was quite common for people to come up or in ordinary discussion to say, I've got a map showing where the treasure is, or a letter showing where the treasure was. So we looked at it from that point of view. But this trail that Sean has followed now, and that we started as well, is about a much more interesting and important aspect of life there at that time, this political life that was going on and where it was going on. And so when we saw odd things like the library, the first open library in Lemon Street, that showed us that there was something beyond just a rather simple tip that was quite commonplace in those days.
Let me establish the mystery, Rex. Between that moment, September of 1695, and the date on the letter, which I believe was 1700, Avery disappeared. Gone from the face of the earth. Sean, I come to you on that. His disappearance was famous. The haul was famous. They'd captured many of his crew. They were hanging them as fast as possible at the execution in London. And yet he was gone forever. And that remained the story for 300 years. Is that correct, Sean?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So, we're in India. He pulls off the big one, the Gunswai Indian treasure ship with, according to Indian accounts, Mughal sources, £600,000 worth of gold, silver, and precious gems, which would equate to at least $108 million today, maybe $150 million. And, this is an age when there's no mobile phones, there's no internet, yet the story of what he did, pulling off the big one, it echoes from port to port and inn to inn and coffee house. And, there's more ballads, plays, songs, books written about Henry Avery than any other pirate of the Golden Age, even though perhaps names like Blackbeard are today more famous. And as that happened, what Henry Avery did is he lit the fuse and threw the hand grenade that started this golden age of piracy. And every sea dog worth their salt wanted to do a Henry.
Surprise, we're not going to follow the piracy trail. We're going a completely different direction. We're going to go to spies and dead drops and Secret Service. The book is The Pirate King, The Strange Adventure of Henry Avery and the Birth of the Golden Age of Piracy. Sean Kingsley and Rex Cowan are the authors. Avery's gone. He's disappeared. It's now 1696 in an inn called the World's End. And in that inn at that day is a man contemplating his own fate. His name is Foe, but he takes on the name Defoe because it sounds more princely. He's always in trouble. He's always in debt. He's always come up with new schemes. He was born well and he lost it in a big gamble of sailing from one side of the world to the other. And he needs a way out. And the way out, of course, is that he's made friends with the reigning monarch, King William, who came over in the Glorious Revolution. Rex, I come to you at this moment because you meet Foe, that you introduce Foe, who becomes Defoe, and your measure of him as not just as a novelist, we know him as Robinson Crusoe, as a merchantman. Is this representative of the time you gambled and you won big or you lost? Thanks, Rex.
Well, yes. I mean, he was the subject of discussions. He was part of the swashbuckling life that was that characterized his type. He was a source of extremely interesting and exciting stories. He was really a important character who fleshed himself out with his exploits, and was probably known, quite commonly in the streets, and talked about for his exploits, and characterized as the sort of swashbuckling rapist that so many pirates were drawn as, because the stories were more interesting. But behind him, what we really didn't know was a very political man.
Oh, you're speaking of Henry Avery. I was speaking of Defoe. So I go to Defoe on you, Sean. Just fill in the blanks, because Defoe one morning finds a man in a wig who is Henry Avery that Rex has just described. Who is Defoe at that moment when they've known each other before, many years before? Who is Defoe at that moment?
So everyone thinks of Daniel Defoe as the guy who wrote the first novel, Robinson Crusoe, was an amazing novelist, but first and foremost, he was actually a true-bred merchant in his own terms. His father was a merchant, dealt in tobacco, wine, beer, hosiery, and he followed in those footsteps, and he should have been very comfortable. His father left him a nice sum of money. He married a very hot 19-year-old and came with a dowry of £500,000. Thank you very much. But, this is a guy who was reckless. He never knew how to quit. You could say that he had an addiction to almost sort of betting in his mentality. And there's a reason for that. He had a massive chip on his shoulder. He was called a dissenter, and dissenters were kind of a religious minority, a subgroup of Protestants who weren't accepted because they didn't follow the prayer book of the Church of England. What did that mean? It meant you had a target on your back. You were always looking where you were going. You couldn't get a good education. He wanted to go to Oxford and Cambridge. He couldn't. He had to go to Morton's Academy. And so he kind of made up for this. He overcompensated in his life to try and prove the world wrong. But every time he got there and he could see the promised land, he fell from glory. So we find him in Tilbury, down by the river at Tilbury in London. It's a boggy, marshy area where, it's not fit for a fine gentleman. But he's bought this tile factory, and fancy Dutch tiles are becoming all the rage in high society. And he's making a lot of quid. He's doing very well, thank you very much, and set up a little pub. But also he started to get the eye of people of importance, and he's feeding them information. And he's watching the people coming and going up the river and through the customs house. And he's biding his time, trying to get his fortunes up again, because he's constantly in debt, in prison. And this is a good place to lick his wounds and wait for the winds to change.
And the winds change with that man sitting there in a wig, because he recognizes him. Rex, the man you were describing, is Avery in disguise. There's a manhunt out for him. And the manhunt is getting closer to him all the time because his crew is being captured. They throw their money around. At this moment, does Avery have a good chance of escaping, or is he a desperate man in your measure, Rex?
A good chance of escaping. It depends who was after him and what they were after him for. I mean, were they after him because he was a menace? By that time, he was no longer, he was a menace maybe on land politically, but by that time, I mean, he had given up his pirate's role. I would have thought that he was much more dangerous for people as a political adversary, and it would appear that his role was really in keeping Scotland particularly safe from Jacobite conspiracies against Queen Anne, and he must have become, I think, much more of a political person by the time he had ravaged the seas and obtained his fortune, which of course gave him the freedom to be a political adversary. What I think this book does is show you just what lies behind the rather elementary descriptions that the popular popular fictions really gave to pirates. He was somebody, a pirate with a brain. I think some people called him the gentleman pirate, because while his fellow pirates were up robbing and raving, he was locked down in his cabin, away from the screams of the people who were being tortured and robbed and so on. So there was I think the thing that has come out of all the research which Sean has done and so on is to show a very, very different side of a popular figure of the day who was given a rather simplistic character by the public.
We're going to turn to that relationship, Rex, in just a moment. The book is The Pirate King, The Strange Adventures of Henry Avery and the Birth of the Golden Age of Piracy, 1696. The two principals here, Henry Avery in disguise and Daniel Defoe looking for an opportunity. And he says to a man he must have known for many years, you know, maybe we can arrange a pardon. Let me think about it. The story so far, Henry Avery makes the biggest score anybody's ever heard of in England. Lots of piracy stories, but this is the biggest. He's a wanted man. The Mughal has made it very difficult for the East India Company to continue, and that's a source of great wealth for the early days of the building British Empire, going through religious wars. William is a Protestant. He will be succeeded by Anne as a Protestant, and she will be succeeded by George as a Protestant, the beginning of the Georges. However, the Catholics went back in, and the Catholic King of France is sponsoring all the time rumors about James, who was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, to come back and take his crown. So there's tension in the air. Our writing hero, Daniel Defoe, has won favor with the court, and especially with the Williams court. And it is now December 1700. We're at an inn in Falmouth, which is the node for mail going overseas and coming in, the Falmouth packet. Sitting in an inn called Penny Come Quick is a man in a disguise whom we know as Henry Avery, although he introduces himself as Mr. Wildest. And in the door walks Mr. Guilot. Sean, who is Mr. Guilot? What are these two up to in 1700?
Well, Mr. Guilot's been a bit of a busy boy. Spoiler alert, this is actually Daniel Defoe in disguise. Defoe has managed to climb himself all the way to the top of the ladder. As you said, he's got the ear of King William III himself, by ingratiating himself and coming to his defense and writing a series of pamphlets, endorsing and backing the king. And, and that's what he was good. He was incredibly powerful, not with the sword, but with the pen. And it's December 1700, they should be having a nice Christmas in London, but no, there's a national election on the horizon in February 1701. And they were down there in Cornwall and Falmouth up to no good, trying to persuade people that they should vote for the Whigs and not for the Conservative Party. That's one of the things they were doing. So they were leaning on people, they were taking the pulse of the nation, because this is a period, there's no web and there's no newspapers yet, but it is the birth of the beginning of public opinion being really interested in politics and talking about it in the pubs and the taverns. So they're spending money. They got a suitcase full of cash, and they're trying to, get the powerful people to turn to their way and get their supporters to vote for them. So that's one thing they're up to. The other, as you said, this is an incredible, dangerous time. The year before, there'd been an attack on King William's life. You know, there are plots being hatched, and all of them begin in France. And Falmouth is the nearest point, geographically almost, to France. So you've got these two characters who are just keeping a real beady eye out for any strange comings and goings. And Avery, we believe, who's now going by the name of Wylust, but also by the name of Bridgman. He's working under a pseudonym. Falmouth happened to be where the beginnings of what's called the post office was born. And the post would come all the way and it would congregate at Falmouth and it would go across the seas to France and then on to continental Europe. And he was doing what a lot of spying consisted of in this times, and counter-espionage, which meant looking at letters that looked a little bit dodgy, opening them up, reading them, and forwarding them to the king in London or to other places. So, you know, they are on His Majesty's Secret Service.
His Majesty's Secret Service. And now we come to the letter that we believe was written at Pennycumquick or near to by Henry Avery, aka Mr. Wiles, aka Mr. Bridgewater. Rex, that letter is the one Mrs. Cowan found in the 20th century. And what was wrong above it was the date. The man Avery was dead. And here he is writing a letter, and it had code on it. The one I copied down that was my favorite was TANK 29 small FB 26. I believe I've conquered part of it. You've given me the 29 means Secret Service. What's the rest of it mean? Did you figure it out, Rex?
No. Not only did I not figure it out, I didn't think I was going to be able to figure it out. I was actually involved in writing a book with John le Carré. I asked him whether or not he thought this code was one that could be broken. He had a very brief look at it and said, well, I don't think so. And I put that idea to one side as well and got on with the rest of my work, because this was a side issue in a sense, although it was intriguing, although I didn't realize just what a big can of information could be opened up and what we would find about the politics of the day and to the most people. And of course, I didn't know at that time about Archbishop Tennyson either. And I didn't know about the coffee house and the way that political information and rumor was passed on. All of these things have actually come out of the further study which Sean has carried out. And further, we did, of course, involve ourselves in quite a bit of research in various archives, but we came to a sort of dead end. And so that dead end was put away in the dusty files that Sean finally found after I'd got on with the rest of the other things in my life, which was the pursuit of East India vessels of Holland and of Sweden. And so I didn't realize just what could be found if one dug deeper and deeper. You know, and what we really did find was that this was much greater than just an ordinary or even an extraordinary story of piracy. Despite the fact that it was, there was at that I knew, of course, about all the plays which were supposed to have been written by Avery. Or rather by, well, it was difficult to know exactly who did. As you know, there's a lot of discussion about who wrote the various plays which were attributed to pirates and so on. But anyway, there it was. And there it stayed. We did have a brief and rather amusing search for where the treasure was, which from the letter in the other letter in Truro, which gives the details of the chest.
There's the second letter later that month.
Yes.
Pennycumquick. However, I want to get on to the Secret Service part. Back to you, Sean. They are They are eyes and ears of the king, but the king does us no favor. In February of 1702, he falls off his horse, breaks his collarbone, and he's dead in a few days. Defoe has lost his sponsor, and he now goes through the trials of Daniel Defoe. He writes a mocking pamphlet that everybody takes seriously, and he winds up in the stocks having vegetables thrown at him. And then he's rescued by someone in power with the new queen, Queen Anne. I think all of these people speak German better than they speak English. He's rescued for what? What do they want him for, Sean?
Well, at this point, they don't want him at all. He's a menace. He's a nuisance. He's had a £50 bounty on his own head. He can't be.
Defoe. What do they want Defoe to do?
Yeah, well, they didn't want him at first. He got letters out to the good and the great saying, listen, remember me. I can still do something good for you. And he wrote a very creeping note to the most powerful man in Parliament, Sir John Harley, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons.
Yes, that's forgotten Harley's name.
Yeah, and he said, give me a voice. He basically offered to create an office for secret intelligence for Queen Anne, newly on the throne. And he was desperate. Not only was he in the stocks, he was penniless, but he still had this unique skill as being, a one-man espionage system within Britain. So they saw the value in him, and they knew if they got him at this low point, that's it. They had him. They had him for life, and he was owned by King and Country.
And King and Country want him to go north. Well, first to the West Country, keep his eyes and ears open. And we don't know at this point, because you've done a great deal of connecting the dots. Is Avery his wingman, his Sancho Panza? How does Avery suit Defoe and Defoe suit Avery at this point? And Avery taking enormous risks that Defoe can't even imagine.
I think that Daniel Defoe is a details guy. He's really good. As you say, they go up to Scotland in September 1706. And this links again to Catholicism's. Scotland and Edinburgh, they're a hotbed of Catholics, what we call Jacobites. There's all kinds of characters coming over the sea from France. And they're threatening, kind of like today with Scottish independence and history repeating itself, they're threatening to break away from the English crown. And London's not going to allow that to happen. So they send Daniel Defoe up there to basically manipulate public opinion by getting control of people in the church, lawyers, merchants, controlling the presses. If you control what is written, you control people's minds. And within 2 months of going up there, they had all those controls. But by being a details person, he needed, as you exactly say, a wingman to keep an eye out and see what was going, and so he didn't get stabbed in the back. Everything we know about Henry Avery, the pirate king, he's an incredible strategist. You don't get most pirates like Blackbeard, Stede Bonny, Calico Jack Rackham, they were hanged. Others died in wrecks. You can count very few actually survived to enjoy their ill-gotten gains. And Henry Avery was one of these guys, very smart, an ex-Royal Navy salt. So he's the thinking man's muscle. He's the enforcer.
I like the duo working together. And I especially like the fact that you found this. Sean, were you flabbergasted when you realized what you'd opened up here?
I got to say to you, John, I've worked on a lot of stories. I've worked looking for shipwrecks in Israel from the late Bronze Age onwards. I've worked with colonial shipwrecks. This has been by far the most remarkable and surprising and shocking expose of my career. And I don't think it will be. And, I remember vividly, when I was meeting Rex in his townhouse in Hampstead, and I was I have a magazine called Wreck Watch magazine. We're doing a special issue about pirates. And I said to Rex, "Oi, do you know anything about pirates?" And he went running upstairs and came down with these 3 dusty folders. And the story that unfolded from that day till today has just been a ridiculous. Yes. And every time I talk to people and we connect the dots, I'm a cold-nosed scientist, and I find myself saying, really? And I think this would be an interesting thing for the readers. Where is that line between what is real and what becomes kind of Daniel Defoe-esque? Because Daniel Defoe claimed when he wrote Robinson Crusoe that, of course, it was fact. It wasn't. It was fact, and he'd made up some of that stuff. So, you know, what we've done is we've kept the facts, but then we tried to do best fit literary reconstructions. And, well, the reader's going to have to decide what they think.
The book is The Pirate King, The Strange Adventures of Henry Avery and the Birth of the Golden Age of Piracy. Sean Kingsley and Rex Cowan are the authors. There's a scene that they wonderfully present of Tennyson, the man, the churchman, who's at the end of the dead drop for the letter that we saw Avery writing in Falmouth. Tennyson and Defoe and Avery, all Avery in disguise, coming out of a play in London in 1719, I believe, or maybe it was 1712, yes. And a play about Avery the pirate, although it's vaguely described as by Charles Johnson, and the man has a pseudonym that's meant to be Avery. Everybody gets the joke because everybody's looking for Avery. He's got a bounty on his head, but most importantly, he has a treasure that he's hidden somewhere. They all want to know where he is. They come laughing out of the play. And Rex, I come to you. Defoe wrote that play, didn't he? Did you know that Defoe was making all this up and they were laughing all the time?
Not at all. In fact, I knew very little by the time that I looked at that. I hadn't been really interested either. I mean, what has interested me is just how much I didn't know and how much I didn't imagine would come out of this, this find and discovery. Otherwise, I might have wasted a lot more of my life pursuing things which I wasn't capable of pursuing, and which Sean has done in a remarkable fashion to entertain me as well as I think other people who are going to read the book. I think this is what we've found is another aspect of the product of piracy. The people who go into it, they're too often rather simplistically described as either villains or rapists. I think actually Avery was described as a gentleman pirate in some accounts, because whilst his men were busy raping and robbing up below, he was down in his cabin reading something intelligent. So what this has really done is to, I think, open up another aspect of this motley bag of disparate people who are labeled as pirates, their incentives. Here was one who was heavily political, who was really intelligent, who sought to enlarge his life. He was not at all the swashbuckling story that's given on the streets as a sort of tabloid description.
Let me read from Defoe, which describes what you're explaining, Rex. This is Defoe after all of the adventures. He writes, "I hope the gentleman won't be offended that by a slip I had like to have given some of them their true names of the pirates in his story. I am not about to point them out nor paint them out. It would make a sad chasm on the Exchange of London if all the pirates should be taken away from among the merchants there, whether we understood to speak of your literal or allegorical pirates." Sean, he's twisting the knife right towards the point that he makes. Who's a pirate and who's not a pirate?
It is an immense irony that just makes me chuckle. It's November 1712, and Charles Johnson's The Successful Pirate is showing in great fanfare in London. And in this play, they're presenting Henry Avery as living on the island of Madagascar with the Mughal emperor's granddaughter. Yet there he is sitting at the back of this play, still alive. And, kudos to Daniel Defoe, and I hope people realize now that he just wasn't the writer of Robinson Crusoe. He was one of the world's first great spies, an incredible thinker. And you know, it does beg a belief. You've got three of the most colorful characters of England at the time, you know, in this unholy alliance designed to protect king and country from the threat of popery, Catholics, and conspiracies at home. All very different, but all completely unified. And yeah, you know, a lot of the academics, they poured over all these texts, all about Henry Avery the pirate, and there's a lot of them, from ballads to plays to books. And they said, well, Daniel Defoe couldn't have written this, and he couldn't have written that because the style is so different. No, that's what he did. It was deliberate. This is a guy who one day he was Daniel Defoe, one day he was Claude Guilot, the other one he was Alexander Goldsmith. They say he had 100 pseudonyms, and he'd write left hand, or he'd dress up as a woman, you know, to take a pamphlet to, you know, it's incredible. They did whatever they had to do to keep the land safe.
And there's still talk of a treasure somewhere. The Pirate King, The Strange Adventures of Henry Avery and the Birth of the Golden Age of Piracy, Sean Kingsley and Rex Cowan. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.